participation. So chat goes in the chat and questions go in the Q&A. That works. Okay, and now we're up to 7:03, so I'll go ahead and introduce who we are and what we're about. This whole series is hosted by the North Branch Friends, which is the Quaker meeting that covers most of northeastern Pennsylvania. And which, if you want to think of it kind of like a church or congregation, you can. And we don't use that terminology. We have some differences, but this isn't a lecture about Quakers, so we won't get too far into that. Okay. I will mention that where this fits into our core Quaker values is that it's part of the stewardship testimony. We talk about our core values as being simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. So stewardship is really simply taking care of our living world, our environment, the things that have been given into our care to protect, right, or the things that are under our sphere of influence, and that protects life. So it's a Quakerly thing to do. But again, we're not here to talk about Quakers. We're here to talk about plastic. And you want to listen to Danica, not to me. So I'm going to give you some better information here on that. I did make a couple notes beforehand, and I noticed first that it's a real challenge to be tasked with introducing somebody you genuinely admire and respect. And especially when that person has a multifaceted string of accomplishments as long as Danica's. I could talk about how awesome she is for a while. But to make it harder, she'd probably be embarrassed if I added to her self-written bio by pointing out that not only did she work for Clean Water Action, one of the largest and best established environmental organizations in the country. It's the original pioneer of grassroots canvassing, by the way, with its origins in lobbying to get the Clean Water Act of 1972 passed in the first place. But she was also promoted through its ranks to become the youngest regional canvas director in their history. And she reported directly to the top administrator in DC. So I won't do that. She'd probably also roll her eyes if I tried to list her many successes in the field since then, or even just give her the full credit she's due for founding PASSAP in Pittsburgh. So then I thought maybe I should take a different approach and tell you that when she says she's a lifelong environmental activist, she really means it. I think her early activism began when she was still a very small toddler, being taught that when we visit the park or the playground, after we're done playing, we always pick up at least 3 pieces of garbage for which we have no responsibility whatsoever, and clean them up before we go home. So since then through now, we could cover a lot. But no matter what approach I take, it's certainly going to be inadequate. So I decided I should just stop talking, stop trying, and let Danica speak for herself. She's quite capable of that. Go talk.
Thank you. Like Weaver said, my name is Danica. I use she, her pronouns, and if there was some hesitancy calling her Weaver, as many of you know, Weaver Cooper is my mother, so explains why she has anecdotes about me as a toddler. But I'm really happy to be here today. I'm going to be sharing with you some information about a project that I fell into a little bit. My environmental activism has not focused on plastic until fairly recently, until about 3 years ago, when I, as a member, or as rather attender of a Pittsburgh Friends meeting, I work with the Earth Care working group there, and we decided to start a project just for the spring season, originally thinking of it as like a Lenten season kind of goal, and then expanding that to a 3-month-long project that ended in April, of just encouraging people to use less single-use disposable plastic. And we were impressed and a little overwhelmed with the number of people who showed up and the extent to which they were interested in really buckling down to do the work. We were very lucky to have a community suddenly of people who were very interested in single-use plastic, who were already aware, for the most part, of its dangers and its harms, and who wanted to continue the work. at the end of our 3-month-long challenge, therefore, with the work not being done, everyone felt very strongly that they wanted it to continue indefinitely. And so it grew from just a one-time project from the Earth Care Working Group of the Pittsburgh Friends meeting to a fairly large coalition of citizens. And we've worked with several other groups in the Pittsburgh area to complete a large number of projects, many of which are still ongoing. One of which is the reason that I'm here today. One of the things that I feel very passionately about and that I feel my skill set leads me to be particularly good at doing is sort of plastics 101, right? We know that plastic is bad in a specious sort of way, and litter is obviously bad. But we found that there is a little bit of an information gap. There's a lot of people who have that understanding, know that plastic isn't great for the environment, and don't really know why or what to do about it. So I enjoy filling that intro level educational gap, and that is exactly what we are going to do today. I am going to share a little presentation with you, which is here we go, on single-use plastics and what they are and why they are bad for us, or in the positive thinking way that I had previously phrased it, why cutting down on plastic will be good for you and good for the planet. The first thing I want to address is what plastic is. Plastic is made from petroleum, oil, and natural gas. It's interesting to learn that even people who work in plastic production don't always know which type of plastic they're making. They don't know if it's coming from petroleum or natural gas, and it's not something that's very well advertised, so it's very difficult to track down which sources of plastic are using which. Additionally, plastic creation is very wasteful of water. It takes 22 gallons of water to make a pound of plastic on average. So if you're thinking about it in terms of those like single-use plastic water bottles that you see everywhere, it takes twice as much water as that bottle can hold to produce the bottle in the first place. And roughly half of the global annual plastic production is destined for a single-use product like those water bottles. And this is something that's been growing and growing recently. Half of all the plastic that exists in the world today was produced within the last 15 years. And plastic is coming up on being less than a century old. That's a very short time span for the amount of plastic to double. So they are really, really ramping up production. And in thinking of what plastic does, it's frequent that we kind of run into this issue where we don't know what it is. It's everywhere, right? It's everywhere in our homes and in our environments, but we don't know what it's made from. So I want to spend a little time at the beginning of this presentation just getting to know plastic a little bit better, right? We've got our plastic friends. We're going to find out more about them. Starting with those numbers, right? We have our little triangle symbol, our little chasing arrow symbol. We have a lot of numbers on there. So we're going to talk about what those numbers mean. Starting with number 1, PET, polyethylene terephthalate. Okay, we're going to hope that this storm doesn't knock out my power, because that would be a bit of an ignominious and abrupt end to our presentation. But starting with our number 1 plastic, PET is one of the most common plastics. It's the number that you see on most of the household food items that you'll see packaged in plastic. It's used to make most water bottles, most soda bottles. All number 1 plastic is intended for single-use applications. So while it may seem like it may be better to, take that disposable plastic bottle and refill it a few times to make sure that you're, getting at least a little more use out of it before you throw it away, it actually increases the risk of leaching and bacterial growth. They're not easy to clean. They're not designed to be cleaned. And this type of plastic in particular is very difficult to decontaminate. So cleaning it properly in order to reuse it, if we were going to reuse these bottles, send them back to the packaging, get them to, fill it up with more soda and send it back out to consumers, that requires a lot of very harmful chemicals. And these plastics in particular, especially when they're reused and heated up, may leach carcinogens. So this is a cancer threat. Talking about our number 2 plastics, our high density polyethylene. This is going to be something that you're also familiar with. You'll see this in your stiffer plastics. Things like milk jugs, our detergent and oil bottles. A lot of toys are made out of high density polyethylene and some plastic bags. This is also the weather resistant, durable plastic. So this is the one that you'll see for false lumber, picnic tables, waste baskets. These are park benches. When you see the ones that are made out of that sort of thick plastic that looks like it's been crushed together like particle board, things like bed liners for trucks. So you'd think that it is more durable. And while it is more durable than polyethylene, the terephthalate, PET, it is, as I'm sure you know, anyone who's left a plastic picnic table out in their backyard for a number of years, still not as durable as many other options. But this is, because of its relative durability, a very popular material for things like recycled plastic raised garden beds. It does recycle a lot more easily than some other plastics like the PET. Moving on now to our number 3 plastics. This is another one you're going to be familiar with because people frequently call it by its name, PVC, polyvinyl chloride. This one is sort of counterintuitively to what we think of, because when I say PVC, I'm sure most of you immediately think of plumbing, but PVC is actually a more soft plastic. It is frequently more flexible. So anything that's a clear plastic food wrapping, a cooking oil bottle, often children's toys like teething rings and animals' toys, a lot of blister packaging and bubble wrap is all used as PVC. This is also, because of its flexibility, used for the sheathing material for computer cables. And of course, to make those plastic pipes and parts for plumbing, to make garden hoses, to make window frames, all kinds of things. PVC is everywhere because it is very versatile. It has also been nicknamed the poison plastic. I think that's a little ignominious because I believe all plastic is poison, but this one in particular contains numerous toxins which will leach throughout its entire life cycle. And when I talk about a life cycle, we're going to get into that a little bit later about what the life cycle of plastic looks like, because it's not the same as what we're used to thinking of with a, tadpole to frog situation. Although this is an important note I want to make about PVC before we move on. Almost all PVC products cannot be made from recycled materials. So if you are buying something made from PVC, it is being made of entirely virgin material. Less than 1% of PVC material is recycled. And the products that are made with PVC plastic are not recyclable. Moving on down to our number 4, that low density polyethylene. So if you remember from our previous slide, we had our high density polyethylenes. Those were the things that are like milk jugs, oil bottles, plastic bags. Low density polyethylene is, it's kind of, you can imagine, it's very similar, but thinner. We've got shrink wrap, dry cleaner garment bags, squeezable bottles, and the kinds of plastic bags that you see for like bread when you buy it in a plastic bag at the grocery store. Most grocery stores use low density polyethylene plastic bags. Although it's worth noting that some clothing and furniture also uses this type of plastic because it is very flexible and it is possible to get it very thin. Moving right on down, I know this is a lot of words right at the beginning, but we only have a few more to go. We have our number 5, polypropylene, which these are sort of the crinkly bags, right? In a cereal box, the plastic liner, that's polypropylene. It's also used for disposable items like diapers, children's toy pails, plastic bottle tops. you know, if you buy like margarine and yogurt containers, you'll see that number 5 on the bottom. It's the same one that's often used for potato chip bags. This is the plastic that's used to make most drinking straws, as well as packing tape and rope. And this one is also, in most places, not recyclable. So this is probably the number 1 contaminant that ends up in recycling in America that is not possible to be recycled. But we'll talk more about the difficulties with recycling in a little bit. We have our number 6, polystyrene, which you guys might have heard called, you know, styrofoam as well. These are our foam, you know, our hot drinking cups. Those takeout clamshell food containers made from foam, egg cartons, also plastic picnic cutlery, foam packaging, like those peanut foam chips that are used to fill shipping boxes. Polystyrene is also used in rigid foam insulation and sheeting for laminate flooring. This is something that I'm sure you guys are aware, like it's not something you're supposed to microwave, it's not good for you. And that's because it will leach styrene into food products, especially when you heat them up in a microwave. And styrene is a known possible human carcinogen. The chemicals that are in polystyrene have also been linked with human health and reproductive system dysfunction. So we're going to start getting into a little bit more about why plastic is bad for us to have around us and near our bodies and in our bodies. Moving down to our last one, our other. Number 7 is my favorite number for plastic because it means absolutely nothing. If you see a number 7 on plastic, the only thing that means is it's not 1 through 6. This could be BPA. This could be polycarbonate. This is Lexan. It was designed as a catch-all phrase for any other plastics. So there are no standardized reuse or recycling protocols within this category. And many of them include categories and ingredients like BPA, which is becoming less common because, as we know, from about 2008 onwards, it's a xenoestrogen. That means it's an endocrine disruptor, which means it can cause all kinds of harmful health effects in adults, but particularly in children and in pregnant women when they are when their children are developing, because it disrupts endocrines and hormones, which impact how your body develops at a young age, especially. So these number 7 plastics are used to make things like baby bottles, sippy cups, water cooler bottles, car parts. BPA is often also found in polycarbonate plastic food containers. So if you see any food container that has the letters PC next to the recycling label number 7, that's a good indicator that it has BPA in it. Some of these will also market themselves as non-leaching so that, you know, they might minimize the plastic taste or the plastic odor that you get when you're using them. But there is a strong possibility and plenty of evidence to support that trace amounts of BPA do still migrate from these containers, particularly if you use them to heat liquids. Now, I know that in the past several years, because of the huge push to get rid of BPA, because of the harm that it was causing, we're seeing a lot of things now marketed as BPA free. But we need to ask the important question is, if there's not BPA in it, what is? And because this is part of that number 7 catch-all category, we most of the time do not know. We don't get to know. That information is not made available to us as consumers, so we cannot necessarily make safe choices for ourselves and for our families. Now, BPA is still very commonly used in receipt paper. This is something that impacts particularly people who work in jobs where they have to handle a lot of receipt paper. There have been studies done that show that even just holding a single piece of receipt paper in your hand for 15 minutes can noticeably and significantly raise the levels of BPA in your system. So it is absorbable through your skin. So if you ever see your grocers wearing gloves, even once the pandemic is over, it may be something that they are aware of and are doing for their own safety to protect their health from this very harmful substance that their job requires them to come in contact with. And as another reason that I prefer not to take a receipt when I go to the grocery store. Now, something that we do want to talk about a little bit before I move on is that symbol, the chasing arrow. I'm going to mention this a little bit too later on when we talk about finding plastic, but the chasing arrow, right, those three little arrows, is a symbol that is not regulated. That is not like the numbers. It is not like even the symbols for designating whether or not the food inside the plastic is kosher. You, as a producer of a product, there are no regulations about whether you are allowed to put that three little arrow triangle on your product. It is not something that we have rules about. So just because you see it on a product does not mean that it's recyclable. Now, I know that for most of you who are not in Pittsburgh, the website recyclethispgh.com is one of the projects that we have with our Pittsburgh area because we are based out of this area. But it is a good thing to sort of peruse. Even if you don't live in the Pittsburgh area, you'll want to go looking for where you do live and find out what their rules are for what can actually be recycled where you live. And you might find that it's not as much as you think. Even in a city as large as Pittsburgh, in our curbside recycling in this city, we can put plastic, bottles, jars, and jugs. They must be larger than 2 inches and smaller than 3 gallons. That is it. They don't specify which type of plastic. That was done in an effort to help simplify what can be recycled versus what cannot be, rather than having people try to check their numbers. But bottles, jars, and jugs, nothing else, which is partly because we don't recycle a lot of the types of plastic that are available for purchase. So if we can't necessarily recycle things, what do we do with them? Now, unfortunately, less than 10% of all plastic produced is recycled. In the United States, about 23% of plastic bottles that are used, and only about 1% of plastic bags are returned for recycling. Even when they are returned for recycling, only a very small percentage of recycled bottles are being used to make new bottles. And that's partly because these brands want to maintain a sort of clean, fresh aesthetic. They don't want you to be using a product that looks like it's been used, because our American consumer mindset teaches us that we need something that's fresh and shiny and clean and new. Coca-Cola only sources 20% of its packaging from recycled material, and Nestle only uses 16% recycled content. And this is partly because recycling in the United States especially is very inefficient. When people take the approach of, you know, I don't know what they can put in my curbside recycling, I'm just going to put it in there and hope it gets recycled. That kind of mindset, unfortunately, often leads to more plastic not being recycled, because if the plastic is too contaminated, the recycling centers will have to spend too much time and money sorting it out, cleaning it, before they can even recycle it. And they don't want to do that because that's costing them money. So instead, they will simply throw it out. They will send it to an incinerator, they will send it to a landfill, and they will send the plastic that could be recycled with it. So it's important to know what those rules are and to follow them, so that if we do have plastic in our homes, we are able to effectively put it where it needs to be in order to be recycled as much as possible. Looking forward, I'm going to talk about sort of where all of these things are taking us. When they do send single-use plastics to landfills, either from contaminated recycling or just from the trash, because most people are putting these things in the trash and not recycling at all, they are not harmless. First of all, in the United States, there are 3,091 active landfills, and that's a lot. We've only got 50 states, but even when they're in there, the landfill liners can leak the harmful pollutants into our ground, into our watershed, and the plastics that are on top of the landfills may be carried away by wind or wildlife. According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation study, it is most likely that by the year 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than there are fish when measured by weight. So if we don't do something, we are on a trajectory that is going to result in a situation that is not only unlivable for us, but unlivable for pretty much everything on the planet. I want to talk a little bit about why that's bad. It seems really obvious, right? When we're talking about walking down the street and just plastic bags being everywhere, when we're talking about going to the ocean and there being plastic everywhere, there are the obvious risks there that we're aware of. Littering is bad. Nobody wants to live in a world that's full of garbage. But what's important is, what is that garbage made of? I know that we've talked a little bit about what it's made of and how that can be harmful, but I want to talk more about how every single stage of the plastic life cycle, from exposure to plastic particles and associated chemicals, poses a risk to human health. So starting at our beginning, we have our extraction and transport. Like I said before, 99% of plastic comes from fossil fuels. That means the extraction of oil and gas, particularly hydraulic fracturing or fracking for natural gas, which, as anybody who lives in Pennsylvania can attest, is incredibly dangerous. That releases an array of toxic substances into the air and water in significant volumes. Over 170 fracking chemicals that are used to produce the main feedstocks for plastic have known human health impacts. And when I say human health impacts, I'm going to say a lot of words in a row right now that are all very scary. We're talking about cancer, neurological issues, reproductive issues, developmental toxicity, impairment of the immune system. These toxins also, when they're in our environment, in our water, and our air, have direct and well-documented impacts on our skin, our eyes, our other sensory organs, our respiratory, nervous, and gastrointestinal systems, as well as our liver and our brain. So obviously, even from the get-go, before we start making things, we are extracting and transporting plastic in a way that is dangerous. Also just realized I haven't moved on to our previous slide here. There we go. That's the slide we wanted to be on. So we move on to our second step here of our life cycle, the refining and manufacture of plastics, right? This requires us to transform those fossil fuels into plastic resins, into additives. Transforming them will release carcinogenic and other highly toxic substances into our air, into our water, and there are also documented effects of exposure to these substances. This includes more issues with the nervous system, reproductive and developmental systems, and in addition to the cancer and other issues that I mentioned before, these can have impacts specifically, including genetic impacts like low birth weight for pregnant women and their children. Especially the workers in the industry of refining and manufacturing plastic and the communities who live near them and in those areas are at greatest risk because they face this sort of chronic and acute exposure during the entire process, both just from the normal off-gassing from these plants, as well as uncontrolled releases and emergencies. You know, you're living next to something that's very volatile, very dangerous, and anytime that company has any type of failure of their safety mechanisms, those people in those communities are the ones who are going to pay the price for it. So then we reach our sort of peak here is when it gets to you, right? So we have consumer products and packaging. This is when we pick them up in the store and we take them home. We have them in our homes. The use of plastic products can lead to your ingestion or inhalation. Accidental, obviously, but we're talking about things breaking down as we use them. There are microplastic particles made up of, the dust in your home. There are, in many ways, hundreds of toxic substances that have known or suspected carcinogenic, developmental, and endocrine disrupting impacts. So when they're in our homes, they are directly impacting our health, even when they are not being, melted down and having these dangerous chemicals off gas in large numbers and amounts. So once we get rid of it, right, we put it in the recycling bin or we put it in the trash can and it goes to the curb and the big truck comes and it takes them away and we don't have to think about it anymore. That stage of the process also includes it results in the release of toxic chemicals, toxic metals in particular. So we're talking about waste management technologies like incineration, gasification, pyrolysis, things that sort of burn them up, melt them down, turn them into something we can just get rid of, right? But these are releasing things like lead and mercury, as well as organic substances like dioxins and acid gases. This is released depending on where they are being broken down into our air, our water, our soil. There is no technology used to manage plastic waste that does not lead to direct and indirect exposure to toxic substances for the people working in those plants and for the nearby communities. Obviously, they're going to be put at risk because of inhalation of contaminated air, direct contact with contaminated soil or water, ingestion of foods that were grown in that soil or water, as well as the toxins from the emissions, things like fly ash, things like slag, burn piles. These things can travel surprisingly long distances and will deposit in the soil and water where they land, eventually entering human bodies after being accumulated in the tissues of the plants and animals in that area. So this finally leads us to our last step of the plastic life cycle, which is the plastic just existing in the environment. And we're going to talk about sort of the difference here between plastic existing in one of two ways. One is a macroplastic and one is a microplastic. A microplastic is anything smaller than 5 millimeters. Macroplastics are the ones that you can see, right? When you go to the beach and you see a bottle cap on the sand, macroplastic, right? Anything smaller than 5 millimeters, it's going to be a little harder to see, microplastic. These contaminate and accumulate in food chains, right, through our agricultural soils, through the terrestrial and the aquatic food chains, and through the water supply. So this environmental plastic will easily leach toxic additives or concentrate toxins that are already in the environment, which makes them bioavailable again for direct or indirect human exposure. It's that same thing as if the little tiny shrimpy life forms at the bottom of the lake are eating the plastic off the lake bed, and then the fish eats all the shrimp, and then you eat the fish. That plastic is not being broken down. It is still in their bodies. It's concentrating higher and higher up the food chain until it gets to an apex predator. And unfortunately or fortunately, humans are apex predators. And that does concentrate these things in our food supply. So as these plastic particles degrade in the environment, it exposes more surface area. That means more leaching of additives from the core of the product to the surface and to the environment, and subsequently to the human body. So we have microplastics now entering the human body through direct exposures like eating, drinking, inhaling, and that can lead to an array of health impacts. Now, obviously, pretty much everything from our previous list applies, but now, because of the way that these are broken down and because of the way that they're being ingested, we're also talking about inflammation, stress oxidation, apoptosis, necrosis, tissue death, things that are linked to negative health outcomes that include cancer, cardiovascular disease, inflammatory bowel disease, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic inflammation, autoimmune conditions, neurodegenerative diseases, and stroke. I'm going to take a quick pause because thus far, everything in our little presentation here has been a bit of a downer. So we're gonna take a breath, and then we're gonna take a look at what's our solution, right? So we have to reduce plastic. We talk about that, three-cornered chasing arrow, that little triangle symbol. And we, as Americans particularly, have been sold on this very corporate idea that we must focus on recycling. You recycle something, it feels good, you did something for the planet, it's great. And I will say, when I talk to people about being an environmental activist, that is one of the #1 things that people tell me. We recycle. Yes, the year 2021, everybody recycles. This is not 1970 anymore. We are not hosting can stomps on the quad. Everybody recycles, municipalities recycle. But the first 2 steps in that chasing arrow are reduce and reuse. So before I recycle something, I want to think to myself, can this be reused? Do we have a community, for example, the Buy Nothing product, where someone might have some use for this product if I don't? Can I make art out of it? Can I transform it in some way into something in my home that can be useful in some way instead of recycling it? Because at the point that it's being recycled, it's out of my hands and I no longer have control over whether that ends up in a landfill or being incinerated or actually managing to make it all the way to a recycling plant. And of course, before we reuse things, we want to reduce the number of these plastic items that we acquire. So that means trying to choose products with non-plastic packaging. This can look like a lot of different things. Trying to purchase in bulk, which will reduce the ratio of packaging to product, even if you're still getting it in a plastic bag. At least it's not coming in 17 tiny plastic bags. And some items like cups or takeout containers can sometimes be avoided by carrying your own reusable containers with you. This is something that I did a lot more before the pandemic. Obviously, some of those health concerns about the virus have to come first, and that can be a bit of a setback when it comes to reducing single-use plastic, when you can no longer walk into a Starbucks and hand them your cup and ask them to use it. But sometimes that means, maybe I'm going to learn to make my own chai lattes at home. I need to look into ways that I can reduce that so I don't bring home so many of those, plastic cups with the logo on them. So I want to do a little experiment here in the chat because we want to find the plastic. So what I would like for everybody to do is to put in the chat every place that you can think of that comes to the top of your head that you have plastic in your house. This is going to look like a lot of different things. And I know people are going to, think of our milk jugs, right? Our plastic bags. I'd love for you to go ahead and type something in there so that we can have a little bit of a discussion in the chat about where we find plastic in our homes. What products do you have that have plastic in them? I know that I have a lot of plastic in my house, not the least of which is a large number of dice. I have a lot of board games. I play Dungeons and Dragons. I have a lot of dice. And while some of my dice are metal, most of them are plastic. I'm seeing some people listing items in the chat. We have toothbrush. It's a really good point, and it's one that we put in our mouths. Water bottles, those freezer bags for, even if you're growing your own vegetables, when you're storing them, put them in a freezer bag. Like product bottles. I'm guessing that's stuff like, shampoo bottles, soap bottles, things like that. You guys can keep that going as well. Yeah, if you have like a dog water dish, I know a lot of people who have kids are going to have, plastic cups, plastic plates. We've got credit cards. I see this is one of my favorites that actually I'm glad somebody caught on to, synthetic clothing. So while people continue to put things in the chat, I'm going to talk about some of the places that we don't think of there being plastic. And one of those is our clothing, right? If your clothing is made of spandex or polyester, those are plastic. And that means just, like when you run your clothes through the dryer and you pull out the lint trap is going to be full of plastic, those little tiny fibers, and they're getting into the air and you are breathing them in and you are ingesting them. They are going to be everywhere. When you see other plastic items that may not necessarily trigger that mind, right? We have things like tea bags. Most tea bags are made from at least some, if not all, plastic. Particularly if you get the kind that are sort of like a ravioli, where the edges are pressed together instead of being folded at the top and stapled, those tea bags have to be sealed by heating up the edges and melting them together. Those are made of plastic. Things like glitter, unless you are intentionally buying biodegradable glitter, most glitter is just made of microplastic. Things like chewing gum. We think of chewing gum as being something that is a relatively natural substance, but surely, you know, all of these, like Wrigley's not going out there and harvesting rubber and gum tree, you know, things to make natural gum. They are producing theirs synthetically, and they are producing it out of a particularly flexible, durable type of plastic. So if you're putting that in your mouth and chewing on it, you are literally chewing on a piece of plastic. And things like our Tetra Paks, those are like the when you buy a carton, you know, a carton of milk, a carton of juice, a carton of vegetable or beef stock, and it comes in that sort of box that's lined with plastic. I'm seeing a lot of really helpful things in the chat here too. Obviously, garbage bags, our keyboards, coffee maker, air fryer, right? Toasters, cell phones, Bluetooth speaker, our laptop, any fans you have. Most of your car is made of plastic. Eyeglasses and the frames, our trash bags, baskets, phone, a lot of people's furniture, yeah, everything. I mean, when you start looking for plastic, you will start seeing it everywhere. The stickers on your produce, which by law have to be FDA approved as something that you're allowed to eat, because they know some people are just not going to bother peeling the stickers off of those apples. Some of those people are toddlers, so we'll give them a bit of a pass, but still, those produce stickers are made from plastic. The lids to a glass jar, in order to get that proper seal on the top of the glass, they have a thin plastic lining inside, even when it's metal. Disposable coffee cups and paper cups are one that's very obvious. We have things like our cigarette butts, chip bags. Most ribbons are made from synthetic materials as well, which means plastic. Most wrapping paper, any wrapping paper that's shiny or glossy, is made from plastic. Diapers are made from plastic. Any soap or hand sanitizer that you have that has those little microbeads in it, those microbeads are made from plastic. And interestingly, because they are so small, they are very difficult to filter out. In fact, I saw a study that was done in Minnesota where they tested all of the craft beer in the area and found that the beer contained microbeads from those soaps and hand sanitizers that have the little beads in them. Now, the last two things that I want to talk about here that I think are the most shocking, and definitely were the most shocking to me, when we look at those biodegradable and compostable plastic objects. So in order for an object to biodegrade, we need three basic things: heat, light, and oxygen. So if a biodegradable plastic or a bioplastic ends up in a landfill site, it does not decompose. In landfill sites, waste is essentially mummified in complete absence of light and oxygen. So food that ends up in a landfill has not biodegraded. I'm sure you guys have seen some of those articles where they do like a core sample of an old landfill and they find perfectly intact hot dogs and banana peels from more than 10 years ago. And if the food is not biodegrading, those biodegradable plastics and bioplastics, even if they would biodegrade into something relatively harmless, will not break down. And it's also worth noting that just like with the BPA, we need to ask what our fillers are. When we talk about the fact that we've replaced something, right? I go to the store and I see, oh, these little plastic looking cups that feel like plastic and look like plastic are actually made from bamboo. Well, I'm sure somebody pulverized that bamboo and pressed it into a shape, but something has to be binding it together in order to make it into this durable little cup. So what is that binder? And is it safe? What is it? Now, the last one, I really should reorder this, but the last one I want to talk about is sea salt, and actually table salt in general. And we talked a lot earlier about how much plastic there is in the ocean, and the ocean is where we get our salt from. So a study that was done in, I want to say 2019, showed that 90% of all table salt brands that were sampled, not just in America, but from all over the world, contain microplastics. Because if the water from the ocean contains microplastics, then when we get those sea salt, table salt, there is plastic in that too. So it is everywhere. So I want to get into now a little bit of a discussion on how we can cut down on this, because it seems really scary, you know, for us to suddenly be looking around and realizing everything in my life is made of plastic. All my ice packs are made of plastic. My phone is made of plastic. My dishes are made of plastic. My clothes and the air that I'm breathing are made of plastic. You know, it can feel a little overwhelming, especially when we start to look at the impact that we as consumers, you know, as an individual can have. Because, you know, I could stop eating salt entirely, but that's only going to impact a little bit of the problem. You know, similarly to when we talk about all things with climate change and environmental things and, you know, fossil fuels, we need to make sure that the people at fault are the ones who are being held accountable. Now, for yourself and for your family and for your health, I think it is fantastic to look to reduce the amount of plastic coming into your home. Look for those alternatives, support them both with your voice and with your money. If you meet somebody who's at a farmer's market and they are selling, you know, plastic-free packaged soaps or food, we want to support those people so that they can continue to offer that as an option to us. But we also want to go to our local grocery stores and put pressure on them to offer those options. And when we as consumers collectively use our voice, which in the language of American capitalism is our money, to speak and show that we do not want that plastic, then it does make an impact. There has been a significant decrease in the number of plastic bags that are being used and produced over the past 5 or so years, because people don't want them anymore. We're starting to realize how bad they are. We're starting to put bag bans in place. And the American Chemistry Council, which sounds like it's a very legitimate scientific exploration, is not. The American Chemistry Council actually represents most of the large producers of plastic in America, works very hard to push that narrative that it is all about your individual accountability. You know, plastic free starts with me. It starts with me putting this in the recycling bin and then never thinking about it again, so that the American Chemistry Association can keep producing all those plastic items, can keep fracking, can keep building out more and more petrochemical plants so that they can keep making more money at the expense of ours and future generations. So let's talk though for just a little bit about the ways that we can try to keep some of that plastic from coming into our homes. We have something that we've put together with Pass Up is 12 easy ways to just cut back. Some of these are going to be things that you're pretty familiar with, right? We're starting off with an easy one. Shopping bags. You know, we can bring our own cloth tote bags to the store. And that's one that we'll want to keep an eye on, right? Because we do have those sturdy plastic bags that lots of places will sell or give away. But we want to make sure that we are, again, trying to keep as much plastic out as possible. So when we can, get the canvas ones, get the cotton ones. They are better for us and for our environment. And you can just throw them in the washing machine, no problem. I already touched on this earlier, but beverage bottles, you know, when we're talking about water bottles, you can bring your reusable bottle or cup, or you can drink out of a water fountain. Again, some of this advice was generated pre-COVID, so obviously we want to do the safest possible thing. Do not use a public water fountain right now. But when you do buy a single serving beverage, you can try to get one that comes in an aluminum can. Aluminum is highly recyclable, so when you do recycle it, it will actually be used. And moving on as well for things like disposable dishes and disposable utensils, even when you're going, and this is actually fantastic advice for right now, if you are going to any event, bring your own. You don't have to worry about who's touched your fork or if they were contaminated with a virus, if it's your fork that you brought from your house that you washed. I, you know, especially before COVID, used to carry a pack set in my car and took it with me everywhere that just had a small container, had a whole set of cutlery, had a small cup, keep everything with me, you know, wherever I'm going. And then when you are hosting an event, opt to use real dishes instead of using dishware that's disposable, just because it's easier. You know, it is easier for now, but we want to make sure that we're being responsible with our planet as well. I did see that someone put in the Q&A that there's a program in their community. I'm not sure which community that would be, but it was Catherine Dodge who said it, to take soft plastic and make a bench for the community for every 500 pounds of plastic they hand over. That's actually a program that is available in a lot of places around the US. The important thing to look into with those groups is what they're doing with the plastic, because most of those places are very reputable plastics recycling, who have invested in a number 5 plastic recycler, who have the actual option to reuse those plastics and get them out of the environment, get them out of a landfill. As we talked about before, obviously any production, use, and waste management for plastics is going to be dangerous, but it is still better to recycle something than it is to incinerate it, put it in a landfill, or throw it in the ocean. So I think that those kinds of programs are actually very helpful. And we, in fact, have several here in Pittsburgh as well. And I move on here to our next step. We've got, like I said, 12 easy ways to cut back. Liquid soap and detergent bottles. There are a lot of options here, but the easiest one is don't buy liquid soap. Choose bar soap. It's still soap. You can also get powdered detergent for things like your dishwasher. Now, everybody used to use powdered detergent, and it was just how you washed your dishes in the dishwasher. So you can still find those. That's what I do with our dishwashers. We just buy our powdered detergent, which actually comes in a box. So it has no plastic lining whatsoever. And if you cannot find the product that you need that works for you in anything except plastic, again, we want to talk about buying in bulk, meaning buy the largest bottle possible for you, your family, your storage solutions, and your budget, because that way you have less plastic packaging per amount of soap you're getting. Things like wet wipes, which, surprise, is made of plastic. You know, it's obviously not cloth, but you can use cloth instead. You can cut up old clothes and t-shirts to make wipes, or you can just use plain water. You know, using something like a cleaning spray comes in plastic may not always be the best option if you're trying to cut down on plastic that way as well. But using soap and water will always work, and using rags and cloths to take care of that will also work. Feminine hygiene is one that people don't necessarily think of, but again, a lot of those disposable menstrual products are made of plastic and contain plastic. And again, if I'm going to absorb a bunch of BPA from holding a receipt in my hand all day, I'm sure most of you can imagine there's a pretty significant risk to keeping something like that either internally or against your skin for long periods of time, 1 week out of every month. So look into either washable cloth pads as an option, or some of the underwear brands that produce period underwear, or looking to getting a reusable menstrual cup. Many of them are made out of silicone. Silicone can actually be sourced naturally if you are looking for it and checking to see what the manufacturers are using. And even if it is still made of some plastic, it's reusable. You will get as many uses out of it as you possibly can, rather than using disposable every month. I love that I'm seeing in the chat also some suggestions for different sustainable things that we can support. That's fantastic. And I would definitely encourage, if anyone knows of some sustainability initiative that they would like to share, that would definitely be welcome in the chat. We want to make sure that we are promoting those things as much as possible and sharing them. Looking at our next category here, we have things like grocery packaging. I mentioned this before, but just look for foods that have less packaging or less plastic. Even if they have, you can't find it with no plastic, you can usually find something with less plastic. So instead of buying individually wrapped snacks, you can buy a large package and then divide it into convenient portions in washable containers. You know, if you have kids, you know the importance of having snack portions, but they don't necessarily have to come pre-wrapped. You know, speaking of wrap, plastic wrap. I don't really use plastic wrap in my house. I just use containers with a lid. There is pretty much nothing that I need to store in plastic wrap that I can't just put inside of a container and put a lid on it. When you do feel like you need a wrap, you can look into alternatives like the beeswax wraps. Or you can just, you know, put a plate on top of a bowl of leftovers, or put the bowl into a reused bag. You know, things like those bread bags, they're a sort of strange tight shape, can often offer a reuse for an item that otherwise would be immediately thrown away. And I do want to bring up our coffee pods. For anybody who has a Keurig, this one's kind of easy. There is literally every other method of making coffee is less wasteful and less expensive than repeatedly buying those K-cups. So whether you're using drip coffee or a pour over coffee or a colador or however you make your coffee, you can also, if you do have a Keurig and you really like the way that it works and you really just want to be able to make one cup of coffee at a time, you can use those resellable little cups that they sell. You can put a tiny coffee filter in it, and you can put a tiny scoop of pour over or drip coffee in it. I do know that Keurig is unfortunately installing software in their newer products that prevents you from using anything that is not a Keurig brand K-cup, because we produce the technology now to try to maintain, you know, their sort of monopoly on that. So unfortunately, that may not work with every Keurig, but if you can, switch to a different method. Again, it is better to continue using what you are using than it is to dump that in immediately in a landfill. I have been working for the past 3 years to remove as much plastic from my life as possible. I still have a decent amount of plastic Tupperware in my house. Why? Because I haven't been able to afford to replace all of it yet, and because I am not just going to throw it away. You know, is it better for that plastic to be sitting in a landfill? Definitely not. When I do choose to get rid of it, I'm going to make sure that I get rid of it in a responsible way. I'm going to pass it on to someone else who will continue to use it. And that is a difficult choice that we as consumers and activists have to make, because I know that it is more dangerous for me to have that in my house, but it is also dangerous for the environment for it to just be sitting out there. So it's unfortunate that we have to sort of make these choices, but I think it is important as well to think of ourselves that way. I want to take a quick break because I did get a question here about Boy and Slat's ocean project. So if that's what I believe it is, that's actually the ocean cleanup, which was founded by Boy and Slat. which is developing advanced technologies to try to rid the oceans of plastic. I don't know too much about their project, exactly what they're doing or how they are accomplishing it, but I have heard that they are trying to clean up 90% of floating ocean plastic pollution. We're not talking about things that are in the deep ocean or things that are sinking, but it is a nonprofit organization that is trying to use advanced technologies to get rid of plastic in the ocean. So that's something that they're using, a combination of closing, the source, which is the plastic going into the ocean, and cleaning up what has already accumulated in the ocean. So essentially, they are trying to work both on reducing and on cleaning up the plastic that is in the ocean. I think it's a fantastic project, but I don't have too many details about exactly what their technology is. I am definitely a fan of anyone who's seeking to clean up that that plastic that's floating around in our ocean, though. On our final slide about our 12 easy ways to cut back on our single-use plastic, though, we have grocery packaging was the one we were talking about before, but condiment packets are things that we might not always think of. So if you're going to a restaurant and they only give you ketchup in a packet, you may be able to look for a pump and dispense it onto the wrapping that you already have instead of taking a cup. You can look for, at a coffee shop, a pitcher of cream instead of those individual creamers. You can also, at your own home, make sure you serve from a large container instead of offering people those small, single-use packets. Things like a drinking straw. Obviously, we have the options to use a washable travel mug or a sippy cup, to buy a reusable straw, or to drink directly from the cup. Some people need a drinking straw to drink. I don't. I like them, which is why I have one, which is made of metal. But most of the time, if I'm out and I don't have one of my straws with me, I just don't take the straw and I drink straight from the cup, like we all used to several decades ago before drinking straws became so ubiquitous. And this is the last one we put on the list because it's really fun: craft supplies. You want to raid the recycling bins for interesting materials. You can also obtain a lot of craft supplies at thrift stores, things like fabric and reuse stores. In Pittsburgh, we have a great one called the Center for Creative Reuse. But see if you can find one in your area that will reuse products. See if you can join a group like the Buy Nothing Project, where you can post things that you might think nobody would want or could have any use for. But as a recent example, in the Buy Nothing project that I belong to, I recently posted to ask if anyone would want about 8 foam cups that I had pulled out of sports bras that I purchased. Anybody who wears a bra is going to be familiar with this. It's sort of just like a slightly concave disc of foam. And I didn't want them in the clothing that I had purchased, so I pulled them out and they were just sitting around my house. And I posted them sort of as a long shot, asking if this is something that anybody could possibly use, if someone wanted to maybe use them as a, an inefficient coaster, or to pad the feet of your chairs, or as I believe I made a joke about them being a particularly bad yarmulke. But someone did. 2 people did. I had somebody who took them because she said she uses things like that to make cat toys. And someone else who said that they sew a lot of their own clothing, and they also sell clothing that they sew. And those are very helpful for sewing things like swimsuits. So you would be surprised at the amount of information that we have available, and the amount of sort of creativity that you can inspire by using plastic. Now, I see that I have a question in the chat about info on how microplastics affect young children. And that sort of depends on what they are. So like I said before, if we're looking at a PVC plastic or any of those number 7 plastics, then for young children in particular, those kinds of plastics can affect their development particularly. So if we're looking at, I know that someone at a university in Amsterdam recently completed a study on this and found that many of those chemicals that are in microplastics will cause issues like hormone disruption. So it can change how their bodies develop, particularly for either babies or fetuses or very young children or prepubescent children. It can affect how their genitals develop. And to answer the follow-up question, can microplastics reach the unborn in utero? Yes, but it's not that the pieces of plastic are necessarily building up in their bodies. We don't want to think about it as necessarily being like, you know, you see those images of like seabirds where they've starved to death and they, you know, open up their carcasses and their stomachs are full of bottle caps and other recognizable pieces of plastic. That is tragic and it is a huge problem, but that's not how it happens for us. What happens is that these chemical compounds get into our bodies and they break down. So just like when I, you know, take a vitamin or take a medication, you know, there's not a sort of pill wandering around in my body, you know, finding the spots that hurt and making them not hurt anymore. They break down into these chemical compounds and they cause different parts of your body to react to those chemicals. So when we're talking about things that are hormone disruptors, essentially what that means is it can change the amounts of estrogen and testosterone and other hormones that my body is making. So if I am in a lot of contact with BPA, it is going to be having a significant impact on how much estrogen and testosterone there is in my body. For this reason, things like BPA in particular have been linked to, on average, a smaller penis size, which is probably something that should be more well publicized because they think that it would definitely help with the PR and getting some changes made about how we deal with plastics. These kinds of things, because of the chemicals that microplastics are made up of, for children, it can cause issues like neurodevelopmental problems. Many of them are carcinogens or suspected carcinogens. Some of them can affect the immune system. Especially very young children are very susceptible and very vulnerable to these effects. But when we're looking at people in particular who live very close to these communities, I'm going to throw out another Pittsburgh statistic just because it's an area that I am very familiar with and I know what the statistics are here. But there is an island in one of the rivers near here called Neville Island. Neville Island has a lot of industrial plants on it. And one of those plants is a coke works, which has actually since been shut down. We're very excited about it. It was one of the projects that I worked on when I was at Clean Water Action. And what they do is they make coke, which is a product that's used to make steel. It's a gray, like hard, porous fuel. It's just basically a rock with a very high carbon content and very few impurities. So what they do is they heat coal or oil. In this case, we're Pennsylvania. It's mostly coal in the absence of air. So it sort of distills it. And it's mostly used in iron ore smelting, in steel production, but also can be used as a fuel in stoves or forges. But essentially, this plant was in violation of EPA air regulations for years and years. And there was a study done that showed over about 50 years in Pittsburgh, the rates of childhood cancer along this, it's in the Ohio River, so we have the Ohio River Valley, and all of the communities that were along that side of the river where the coke plant was on Neville Island, showed rates of childhood cancer that climbed over a period of 50 years to being almost non-existent, to being incredibly high, something like 15 to 20% of the children by the end of the study in those communities had developed some kind of cancer. 15 to 20, you know, it's not a big number if we're talking about some things, but 15 to 20% of children in a small geographical region who have developed childhood cancer is incredible. And I mean, not incredible in a good way, but almost unbelievably bad. So being around these kinds of things can be very dangerous. Now, coke and coke plants, as an example, is not necessarily great as it relates to our discussion of plastic. But these kinds of things are very much on my mind because, as some of you may or may not know, north of the city of Pittsburgh, Shell is building an ethylene cracker plant. That's going back to our plastic lifestyle of our refining process, where they bring in natural gas and they refine it or crack it into substances that can be used to make plastic. So what they would be doing is bringing in natural gas and, through the process of ethylene cracking, turning it into what we call nurdles. These little tiny plastic, like if you've ever busted open a Beanie Baby, those are very similar to what we're talking about. Nurdles are these little beads of plastic. And these cracker plants are very harmful. They generate a huge amount of air pollution through the process of ethylene cracking, and they also generate a large amount of pollution in other ways. Part of that planned petrochemical build-out includes 1,700 new fracking gas wells in southwestern Pennsylvania to support that plant. So in addition to all the issues of fracking that we already have, they're planning a huge build-out of more wells. And as you can imagine, those little nurdles are small and difficult to control in large numbers. So we end up with a huge number of them being in the environment. And of course, this plant is built right on the river. So they are most likely going to end up in the area, on the ground, in the water, washed into the water, and downstream. So just to sort of return to our slides here for a little bit, I know that we're talking a lot about a bunch of, really crazy stuff, and it's important to, ask ourselves, will it be enough? And the answer is probably not. We have started down a path that we can't quite turn back from, but we can stop going down it. We can go a different way. There are lots of ways to get involved. And it's important that we think of ourselves in this way as what I like to say, both and activists, rather than either or activists. In every line of social justice work, you will run into people who tell you that you cannot be, you can't be an environmentalist and still drink out of plastic cups sometimes, even if they're reusable plastic cups in your own home. But we are not separate from the world that we live in. We are not separate from the society that we live in, and we have to exist in that society and in that world, which means I can't remove all the plastic from my house. If I had no plastic in my house, I wouldn't be able to talk to you guys because my computer is made of plastic. So we want to make sure that we have as much of that both and mentality as possible. I am both an environmental activist and someone who has to live in a society that requires me to participate in and accumulate plastic. So I want to try to be as responsible with that as I can, but with that understanding of it's not about necessarily my individual accountability. We need to support larger initiatives. Definitely want to support those initiatives that were brought up, the ocean cleanup, as well as that Ecovative? That's interesting. I get it. It's play on evocative. Ecovative, company that's making materials out of mycelium versus plastic. I have seen a lot of incredible mushroom fabrication that I think is just amazing. I love things that are made out of mushrooms. I think they are so cool and sustainable, but primarily just really interesting to me. But I digress. We want to do things like support larger organizations, you know, find an environmental group that's doing what you like doing. And if you don't have time to volunteer, or if you don't have time to dedicate yourself to this work, you can also support them in other ways, you know, write letters, make phone calls, give money. If you can't speak with your words, speak with your dollars, because we're American and that is how we do it. I do have a link here to the Break Free from Plastics Pollution Act that I'm going to post. This is an incredible piece of legislation. I could have spent 2 hours talking about this legislation alone. And it is just truly phenomenal. So this is an act that is intentionally going to strengthen environmental justice, is going to test reuse and refill programs, is planning to actually hold companies accountable for the products that they create and make transparency. They're going to incentivize good design, require real recycling programs, reduce the toxic substances that are involved, reduce the pollution that's involved, reduce single-use plastic, and manage our own domestic waste. That portion of this in particular is very important because, as you may or may not know, the United States exports a lot of our waste. We export a lot of our recycling and we export a lot of our trash. We are just shipping it across the oceans to other countries to deal with. And increasingly, due to environmental or just political reasons, those countries don't want our trash anymore. They don't want it. It's polluting their environment. It's polluting their homes, and they don't want our garbage causing them all of these problems. So, you know, it's, as a piece of legislation, is one of the most inspiring things that I have personally seen, and I am very, very supportive of it. Definitely check out the Break Free from Plastic Pollution website that I put in the chat, as well as the link to that Google Doc. That was for a call-in day specifically, but the information holds up. It has some background on the act itself. It also has information on how you can reach your members of Congress to outreach to them, to specifically write them a letter. It has a call script for you. It has links to social media and how you can share information about it. It has a graphic for you to share if you want to. It has some sample language for texting all your friends and your members of Congress. So definitely check that out to, you know, support this bill and about it. Internet connection holds up because we're having some extremely crazy weather here in Pittsburgh. So hopefully I will still be able to stick around and answer them. But I mean, speaking of climate change, we've had a lot of storms this year that are honestly unprecedented. In my neighborhood alone, I think there have been 9 separate transformer fires in the last 5 months. So okay, I am seeing a question here that someone's having difficulty copying the links that are posted in the chat. So that's something that we can definitely post on the Facebook event or on any of the other ways that we were communicating about this event. So the couple of links that were put in the chat, we can definitely make sure that they're shared there so that you guys don't lose them. So does anyone have any questions or any other environmental groups or pieces of legislation that they'd like to share? I know it's a lot of info dump. I talk a lot and I talk quickly. I used a lot of big science words. Something else that may be helpful is if you just have, because I tried to keep these talks very general, if anybody has a topic like when Elaine earlier raised the question about microplastics and their effect on children, any further topic that you would like to hear more about, I'm happy to speak to anything. Like I said, spend a decent amount of time doing this kind of plastics 101. So I try to keep it very general, but if you guys have some specific topics that interest you, I'd be happy to speak more to those. Someone has asked if paper drinking straws are still manufactured. Yes, these are manufactured. Paper is one of the things that you'll see people talk about a lot in terms of their sustainability and their viability. Paper products do require water to make them. So you see a lot of environmental activists who are not a fan. Also, paper drinking straws are not ones that a lot of people are fans of, because if you are, like me, a very slow beverage drinker, you're going to spend a lot of time with that straw and it's going to start to not work so well. But there are companies, for example, Starbucks is actually switching to using paper straws. They're phasing out their plastic straws, which is fantastic, and I'm very excited about it. When possible, we do want to try not to use a straw at all, which I know they are also encouraging people not, to not take a straw at all. And there are also other alternatives to paper straws, but yes, they are still manufactured, they are still available, and they're definitely a better alternative because, as we all know, paper breaks down pretty quickly and safely instead of plastic. It's also worth noting, since I mentioned Starbucks, that these large companies, they wield a lot of power, but there are bigger places, at play here. We have, for example, Starbucks in 2014 was approached by a zero waste initiative who wanted to help them reduce the amount of plastic that was coming out of their storefronts and out of their products. And Starbucks was on board. They wanted to switch to all plastic free. They wanted to implement, like when you go to Panera, they ask you if you're dining in or if you're taking out, and they'll give you a ceramic bowl if you're sitting in their store. They wanted to implement that, and they went to their contract with their paper and plastic suppliers, and they could not get out of them. A lot of these contracts are airtight, and legally speaking, these chemical companies that produce plastic wield a huge amount of power and have a lot of clout when it comes to that negotiation, where it's just not possible for even a company as large as Starbucks to get out of a contract that requires them to continue putting plastic cups in their stores. So now, when we're almost 8 years later at this point and they're starting to phase those out, I can only assume they managed to get out of part of that contract. So it's, it's inspiring to see those kinds of changes being made. And we do want to put pressure on those places that we can see, but it can be very difficult for them as well to make the choices that they want to make.
Kristen asked if she could ask an unrelated environmental question, and I think it got lost in the scroll there.
Yes, absolutely. And I did see as well that Elaine has a question here about there being a precedent in legal activities, like holding drug companies accountable for the drug problem. were you asking about, sorry, Elaine, if you can clarify for me while I answer Kristen's question about cat litter, if you can just clarify, like, do you mean specifically you want me to talk about the drug companies, or if you are talking about other legal precedents? And while you are putting that up, I just want to say, like, kitty litter is one of the tricky ones. We're going to start with talking about how we are required to dispose of cat litter, because you might say it's not plastic related, but it absolutely is plastic related for a few reasons. One, guess what some cat litter is made out of? Because it's made out of plastic, and it comes in plastic bags, it comes in plastic bins, so it definitely is related to plastic. And when you dispose of it, for example, living in Pittsburgh, I am obligated by the laws of the city that I live in to put that inside of 2 plastic bags. If I'm disposing of kitty litter in my city, I have to put it inside of a plastic bag, inside of another plastic bag. Now I can see the practical applications for that, especially for our sanitation workers, you know, but it's something that makes it very difficult to be environmentally friendly with your cat litter. So of course, the easy answer is cat litter is not eco-friendly. I actually am a huge advocate for the practice of teaching your cat to try to use a toilet. And there are a lot of good ways and training tools to get your cat to use a toilet instead. Now, there are a lot of roadblocks to this. One, I own a cat. He's brain damaged. He can't be trained to do much. He uses his litter box reliably, but he is afraid of the toilet. So that's a no-go for me, right? And I can also see people just making a personal choice. They don't want to have to tell their guests, you know, oh, if you go in the bathroom and there's poop in the toilet and it's just the cat, don't worry about it. Or, you know, oh, when you go to the bathroom, make sure you put the seat up when you're done. Otherwise, the cat won't be able to go to the bathroom. I also knew someone who'd had trained their cat to use a toilet and then had to start locking him out of the bathroom because he realized that he could flush the toilet. And flushing the toilet was very interesting, and he did it constantly, and it was driving their water bill up. Not ideal. Now, there's a lot of other eco-friendly cat litters out there. You can find cat litter alternatives that are made out of corn and soy and sawdust. And honestly, it's really hard to say, but there are some brands, for example, World's Best, which is a corn-based cat litter. And there's also brands like Feline Pine, which is a wood cat litter, but it's non-clumping. So, you know, it holds odor really well, though. It smells piney and wonderful. And then there's also just lots of things, like there's a brand that I remember called Fresh News. Fresh News is a recycled newspaper cat litter. So, you know, it's mostly about finding the brand that works for you. But the brands that I just pulled up here, if I found, you can get all 3 of those are available on Walmart, Amazon, and Chewy.com. So they're widely available, and you can, you know, sort of try to find what works best for you. If you are willing to shred newspaper from your own newspaper and use that, that's great. Sand, I think, is a little trickier. I saw that there. Jan suggested using sand. I think that's, you know, if it works for you, a great option. I think the primary appeal of most modern cat litters is that they don't smell bad, which might be a little bit of an issue with some of those. And I do see someone in the chat mentioning that they don't deal with Amazon and Walmart because they don't treat their workers fairly. That's an incredibly good point, and it is definitely a worthwhile stand to take. I, again, find myself in that sort of both and category where sometimes I need things that will work for me and work for my family. And sometimes the only place that those things are available is on Amazon or at Walmart. And I think it is important that we, like I said, as Americans, choose to vote with our dollars. And I want to keep my money out of the hands of the Waltons and out of the hands of Jeff Bezos as much as possible. But it is also important to recognize that the fault does not lie with all of their customers. It lies with the people who have the wealth, who are hoarding the wealth, and who are using it irresponsibly. So we want to make sure that if we are taking action like that, it is something that is a personal action. Because a lot of environmentalists get very gatekeepy. And I think it's very important to try to stay as open as possible, because nobody wants to join your movement if they feel like they get blamed for making all the wrong choices. And when it comes to environmentalism, it is not physically possible to always make the right choice. Do I think it's the right choice to never shop at Amazon or Walmart? Yeah, I agree. We shouldn't be shopping at Amazon and Walmart as much as possible. Just like, you know, as much as possible, we should be shopping at farmers markets, supporting local. But sometimes it doesn't work. Did we get clarification on Elaine's question here? Okay, so Elaine, are you asking me to speak to the legal action about like holding drug companies accountable for the opioid crisis? Or were you using that as an example for a larger question? I'm not sure if I understand. And of course, if anyone else has any other topics that they'd like me to speak about, I do like to do that. Has any company been held responsible for the microplastic in the environment, its effects on people? We are trying to do that. There are actually some really incredible campaigns. Like a lost and found. So you'll see like a Twitter campaign where people go around and pick up litter, and they take a picture of the label, and then they post it on Twitter. They tag the company that it came from with some, you know, campaign tagline like, did you drop this, or did you lose this, or is this yours? And that's, I think, a really fantastic way to draw attention to that. There is, I'm gonna see if I can remember the name of it now, but there's a really fantastic app that they're using. Here it is, Literati. Literati is a project of people who pick up litter on their walks and post it on their app so that they can essentially identify the litter in their city by object, by material, by brand, which helps with lots and lots of studies that are being done on this, and also helps, you know, publicize where this litter is coming from. In terms of legal action, I'm not familiar with any legal action that's been taken against any brand in particular for litter, unfortunately. But there are a lot of programs and campaigns that use this kind of PR to hold different places accountable and post that in a public forum so that they, you know, either have to ignore it where it is getting a lot of attention, or where they have to address it in some manner. I hope that answers your question, and I hope that you got everything, because I know my internet connection was a little unstable. There was some lightning. Take this opportunity to wet my whistle a little bit.
Okay. Let's see, you explained things to a well-educated audience who understands a lot of the big science words, but if they wanted to explain to, say, a 10-year-old quickly why plastic is bad for your body, that what kinds of things could they say to a child?
I mean, I'm a big fan, and I came by this one honestly, of not talking down to children. So I would probably say to a child most of the things that I said to you guys, albeit with more analogies. So that's honestly what I have found is the most useful tool in communicating with children or with people who just might be less educated about environmental issues, is put it in terms they can understand. And of course, our old fallback, put it in their backyard. You know, when we're talking about issues with plastic, we're talking about issues with fossil fuels. And if you live in Pennsylvania, you know that that is a very close to home issue. So that's an issue that impacts a lot of people in Pennsylvania, but also in America. Like, I don't think there's anywhere left in America that's not impacted by fracking. You know, you either have the wells or you have the pipelines or you have the refineries. They're there. So the first step is going to be, you know, put it in terms that they think about. You know, it starts the gears turning how it impacts them. But what I have found to be a very helpful conversation starter, I'll get to children in a second, but for most people, is start by talking about what they can recycle. This is huge for me. So if you guys check out the, I'll just put this link in here, but it's the recyclethispgh.com website. I know, like I said, it's very local to Pittsburgh, but you start to look at it and it's like, can you recycle pill bottles? No. Can you recycle the cups from your, you know, takeout? No. Can you recycle your milk cartons, the paper ones, instead of the jugs? No, you cannot. So every conversation that I've had with people that starts out with them asking me questions about like what they can and can't put into their recycling ends with them going, this is unbelievable. Like, all of this is just going straight into the trash. Like, we shouldn't even be doing this. We shouldn't even be getting these. And that's when you start to get them, right? You're just like, yeah, I know, you know, you need to be, there are places that will sell you milk in glass bottles. You should be buying that milk, you know? So you can use what I consider as sort of a gateway, like gateway drug, but like gateway to anti-plastic environmentalism is talking about an issue that they already understand and have some questions about. And so I do have a couple of questions in the chat. So I have Andrea asking, why can't pill bottles be recycled? Good question. Seems like they should be. But pill bottles are, it's about what they're made of, which is that number 5 plastic. And it's about their size. So the size and shape of pill bottles make them very problematic for many recycling systems. It's the same reason that putting your recycling in one of those thin plastic grocery bags can be very problematic, because those grocery bags get caught up in the machines that are used for sorting recycling. So when you put your pill bottles into your curbside recycling, they go to a recycling plant. Let's assume everything goes smoothly and they actually make it there and they're not, you know, rerouted somewhere in the meantime. They sort their recyclables most of the time with a screening device that's called a trommel. So this is like a rotating screen with a bunch of small holes. It's used to sift through material, let all the unwanted debris fall through. So things like bottles and cans and containers like water bottles will stay in the trommel and be sorted for recycling, but things like broken glass or tiny pieces of plastic that are too small to recycle, or rocks, you know, or whatever other debris has gotten in there, will fall through the holes and get sent to the landfill. So that means that your prescription bottles, because they are small enough to go through those holes, even if they are going to a recycling center that can process number 5 plastic, which are few and far between to start with, then most of the time, if they are using a trommel to sort their recycling, those pill bottles are falling through the trommel and being sent to a landfill instead. I do see that I have another question from Catherine in the Q&A, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But when you're talking to kids about this, I think the important thing, depending on how old the kid is to start with things that are not overwhelming. Because like somebody said in the chat, it can be overwhelming. this is a lot. It's very scary. It seems like something that we can't do or can't change. It's very big, and it is going to require a large amount of change from corporations that are huge, that are powerful, and have no financial incentive to make those changes. So we don't want to start off by telling them that plastic is going to kill them and give them cancer and make them have a small penis, and that there's going to be more of it than there is fish in the ocean within their lifetimes, right? We don't want to scare them and give them plastic nightmares. We want to start off with them sort of understanding. There's a really great film called I think it's called The Life of a Spoon. I'll find a link for it. There's a really great 2-minute video, The Story of a Spoon, that's what it's called. And I'll put that in the chat as well. But 2-minute video runs through in a sort of dramatic fashion how a plastic spoon is made, how it gets into your hand when you're at your backyard barbecue. And something that people often ask me when they watch this and they see how much is involved in the entire process of creating a plastic item, like, why is it so much cheaper? Like, how is it physically possible that a plastic spoon with all this work that has to go into it is cheaper than a metal spoon, which seems like it might require less work? And the answer is because of these huge corporations that are lobbying, that are putting their money behind legislation that will subsidize what they're doing. Plastic production's not cheaper. Creating plastic is not cheap. It is a hugely expensive industry, but these industry giants have successfully passed legislation that offer them huge government subsidies for doing it. So they are not the ones paying that. Which honestly is another great talking point for some of your more conservative friends as you start talking to them about how their tax dollars are essentially being spent to subsidize something that's bad for them. I also used to get questions when I was at Clean Water Action, when I was working in a sort of direct outreach capacity. When I started there in the field canvas and I was knocking on doors and talking to people about the environment, and they would, I get some apprehension from some of my peers and some of the new people that I was training from approaching people who seem, for lack of a better term, like a redneck, like somebody who's going to be pretty conservative politically. My answer to that is always, those people are your best friend when it comes to water and pollution, when it comes to preserving wild spaces, because those are the people who are spending time there. Those are the people who are going to say, yeah, I would love to hear more about how you guys are going to solve the sewer runoff problem, because I'm sick of spending my Saturday mornings in the boat watching poop and pieces of toilet paper float by when I'm trying to go fishing. Those are the people who care if there's plastic in the lakes and the rivers and the ocean, because they are the ones fishing there. They're the ones who care if their wild spaces are too polluted to actually hunt in, because they are the ones hunting them. So I think it's really important as well to remember that plastic is not something that is necessarily as polarizing and divisive as some other environmental, political issues might be. It is something that impacts everyone. And like we said before, the people who are most impacted by this are the people who work in those factories and who live in the communities next to them. These are like the blue collar people who work in the factories are going to be harmed the most. So those are the pieces of information that we want to push when we're talking to people who are maybe a little more hesitant or view it as a sort of left-wing liberal issue. And when you're bringing people in, it's about being welcoming. We don't want to try to, start a conversation with somebody by accusing them of being a bad environmentalist, because they won't listen to you. Start the conversation by talking to them about something that you've learned, or by trying to answer their questions about curbside recycling and how you've just found out that it apparently doesn't work at all. And they will start asking those same questions of, well, I have never thought about this before, but it is actually ridiculous that I cannot buy cottage cheese in anything other than a plastic tub, because it wasn't always this way. You know, you think about it, this huge plastic movement, there's like a throwaway line in that movie, The Graduate, about this, where it's like, you know, there's this whole scene on the future plastics, right? Which like now seems almost apocryphal, but is very true, that it was a throwaway line at that time, because until like 40 or 50 years ago, there just wasn't like plastic. People didn't have plastic grocery bags. People didn't have plastic cups. You know, it was this big push in like the 40s and 50s to move people to this idea of a throwaway culture, where it's like, you don't have to clean, you don't have to worry about it, you don't have to clean up after yourself, you can just throw it away. But as we're increasingly learning, there is no away. You know, there's nowhere for it to go except here, which is the planet that we live on. Now, to get to Catherine's question about single-use plastic collection, and people thinking that it all gets dumped into landfills, for one thing, like I talked about with the way that recycling works in America, a lot of it does get dumped into landfills. If a recycling center gets a load of plastic that's too contaminated, and I mean contaminated with types of plastic they can't recycle, with garbage, with thin pieces of plastic bag that are going to get their machines tangled up so they don't want to have to deal with them, or with food, because if people don't clean their recycling, then it's dirty, they don't want to have to deal with the dirty recycling, it is just going to get sent to a landfill. In terms of single-use plastic collection, that's highly regional. It's going to depend on where you live and where you are. Like, many rural communities do not offer plastic recycling. Some of them will offer plastic recycling, but not glass, because the glass is, you know, more dangerous when it breaks. It's very tricky. And it can be, yeah, so single stream recycling, yeah, that's absolutely fine. So single stream recycling, it depends on where the plastic is going. And this is one of the hardest questions to answer, because it's one of the things that's intentionally kept very quiet. So, you know, your municipality is the one picking it up, but they are not the ones dealing with it. Municipalities in America do not own recycling centers. They essentially just collect it, and then they contract with a company that owns a recycling center and is going to process it. They have to adhere to that contract. So whatever your city or municipality is putting out saying these are the guidelines for what you can put into your curbside recycling has to do with their contract with that recycling center. The same goes for any other places you see a recycling bin, in hospitals, in schools, on college campuses, you know, anywhere you're seeing a recycling bin, they are you know, they're contracted with that recycling center to adhere to the rules on the bin. Now, most single stream recycling programs are fine because they're going somewhere where it's going to get sorted, but that means a broken glass bottle doesn't get recycled. A small bottle doesn't get recycled. And if it's too dirty or contaminated, not going to get recycled. It's also worth noting that most recycling centers are single stream, so most places that are collecting completely separate recycling, unless it's a large collection center where they actually have like those huge separate dumpsters. If it's like a small place where you just have like the 3 different bins for the different types of plastic, those are all getting dumped into the same truck when they get picked up anyways. I would say about 90% of the time, they are going to a recycling center that's just going to dump them into one load and then sort it out afterwards, because it's much easier. You know, they have a sorting at that point, and because of the inability of the average American consumer to determine whether they should be putting something in the left bin or the right bin, they're going to have to sort it out anyway. So there's not a real problem with single stream recycling. The problem is with how the recycling centers work, what they can recycle, what percentage of things end up recycled, and how much of it is just being sent to a landfill. But there's not a particular problem or discrepancy between single stream versus separated recycling, unless you are at one of those large recycling collection centers that have the big separated dumpsters, in which case those are actually going to a place that will process them separately most of the time. It's a difficult question to answer just because it is so unique to each recycling center, because they are run as separate companies and they get to do whatever they want to at their recycling center. I did see, yes, there are replacement materials being developed to make products that don't use plastic. You see this all the time. But it's also worth noting that like a lot of these materials are just things that we have, you know, like if we're talking about most household items, they can be made out of metal or glass or wood, you know. There is a huge emphasis on trying to develop safe and effective bioplastics for where we need them, for in our hospitals, for example. But when we're talking about like household items, it's like, you know, you don't need a Tupperware. You can use a glass container if it needs to be microwavable. You can use a metal container if it doesn't need to be microwavable. We don't need a safe form of plastic because we just don't need the plastic at all. I know we're coming up to the end of our scheduled time here. So in the last few minutes that we do have, does anybody have any final topics or any final questions? Okay, so I just got two questions. One of them is fairly easy and one of them is very hard. So I'll answer the easy one first. What about bamboo products? Bamboo products where you can still see the like wood grain of the bamboo are A+++. Bamboo products where they say this is made from bamboo, but you can't see it. Things like bamboo sheets, things like plastic that's made from bamboo. You want to look at what is also in there. I have spent a time and a half trying to find sheets that are not synthetic. And I finally thought I found one and I bought them, and then I opened up the packaging and I unfolded the sheet and the tag said that it was 10% polyester, and I was just about ready to tear my hair out. But you know, it depends. If you can't see the bamboo in it, then you need to find out like what is the binding agent, because most of the time the answer is plastic. I'm in other news probably going to be switching to either 100% cotton or linen sheets in the near future, although those are apparently difficult to come by also. The other question I got from Elaine is, how do I feel about the future? Which is, I mean, you know, I am not the youngest generation currently walking on this planet, but I am still under 30. And I am honestly hopeful, upset, stressed, terrified, but we are making a lot of good moves. The environmental movement has been steadily growing. The demand for single-use plastics has been steadily decreasing. Like I said before, you can see that in their sales and in their production. It's dropped fairly significantly over the last 5 years, and that's because people are starting to realize it's bad, we don't want it. We are starting to see movies come out, you know, about the problems that are being made, about the, you know, pollution in the oceans. We're seeing promotion of plastics, and we have the, you know, the Paris Climate Agreement, and we have a lot of moves that are being made in the right direction. I think there's a lot of ways to go, but I am hopeful, and I am hopeful because every time I talk to people about this, there is a huge amount of interest in it. And also because I have to be hopeful, because this is the only planet I've got and I have to live on it for like probably another 70 years. So we gotta do something. But I, in all seriousness, I am very hopeful, especially if the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act can get even a toehold in Congress. It will be a huge step forward for the environmental movement. Did also see a question here about material for hiking and outdoor clothing that's not polyester or plastic. That's another tricky one, but I have been very impressed with clothing companies that use micromodal fabric. Micromodal is made from beech trees mostly. And so there are a lot of products that can be made with fabrics like micromodal that are sustainable and safe. But that's tricky. You know, as somebody who is very active and who needs stuff that's going to be sweat wicking, it is hard to find. But also when it comes to being prepared, especially for cold weather, I'm probably going to offend some of the vegans in the audience, but I am a huge advocate for animal products in this case. You know, if you want to keep your feet warm, you need wool socks. Polyester socks don't work nearly as well, even if they're twice as thick. So, you know, finding places where you can get it, finding affordable ways to get those items is probably your best bet. But also, I would never tell somebody that they are being a bad environmentalist because they want to go hiking and they can't afford the fancy socks. You know, people should be hiking, people should be enjoying nature, people should be getting active and getting outside if they can and they want to. And if they cannot find or cannot afford or have tried these products and the non-synthetic products don't work for them, then it's more important for them to be involved in the environmental movement and to be supporting these larger movements and these, you know, congressional actions than it is for them to buy socks that are not made of polyester. Yeah, I agree. So Jan said in the chat that everything seems to be a trade-off, and that's part of why I like to phrase things as a both and activist. I can be both an environmentalist and I can also own polyester socks, because my running socks, I think, are polyester, and I like to run, and they're very nice socks. Yeah. I've seen that. There's lots of great ways to sustainably help control things like that. I know around here, because Catherine said in the chat that there's, you know, you see sheep grazing under solar panels, and that's great. Using solar panels for parking is great. Using goats for controlling underbrush is great. All of these sustainable initiatives are just A+ in my book. Oh, I posted a link to the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act further up in the chat, as well as a link to a Google Doc about a toolkit on how to contact your representatives about the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And so those are, yeah, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. I think it's a great name. It is a little wordy, but it's if you look up like a BFFPA or Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, or find the link earlier in the chat that I posted, then yeah.
Okay, so and I guess we are at our 9 o'clock time. I don't know if people want to stay over or not, but we're going to run out of that anyway. The YouTube video will be posted within a few days, and we'll make sure everybody who is here gets a link. We'll send it out by email. It will also be in the Facebook event. And if anybody has more questions about the Quaker meeting that hosted tonight's webinar and the earlier ones, same meeting that Danica's a member of, okay, then you can see our website at northranchfriends.org. You're welcome to message me, message Elaine, message any of the other people here who attend our meeting. Jan Robinson is here, and we're happy to make sure that you can find out whatever you'd like to find out. If you want more information about Pass Up Pittsburgh, we'll make sure that that link is in the chat. I don't think we've got it in there right now, but it is in the Facebook event, so we'll make sure. Oh, there we go. Okay. And if you want to reach Danica, she put her email up here, so you can contact her directly. Please do share the YouTube video. There were lots of people who expressed interest and couldn't make it tonight. I got quite a few messages this afternoon. but please feel free to share the video once it's posted. Encourage people to comment on it and let us know they watched it. And if they have any questions and post it there, we'll see what we can do about giving them some answers, at least in the short term. Thank you so much, Danica.
Thank you.
I told you this was amazing.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I appreciate Jan's comment that we should share the video with Congress, but I defy you to get Congress to apply 2 hours of their attention span to it.
Congress has to know your big science words too.
Well, they don't actually.
Yeah. Okay. I shouldn't put that in the video that's going out. Never mind. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Okay.